Okay, now jumping into a little bit of the texturing side of things, I'm gonna show you as an example the shirt, which is probably the most interesting one. Let me turn all this off so we can go through it slowly. Okay, so usually I start with the base color and then some color variation. This is the very base of it. This is gonna be covered pretty quickly. But still, even if you don't detail some parts, it's still gonna have what's below, right? So that's what you want, not having to take care of each single part. That's an advantage. Then we have the tear, mostly on the edges. It's a little bit too pronounced, but when we start adding some details on top, that's gonna be broken up further, so it's gonna look more interesting than that as we add some more stuff. And then we have this little pass of pitch fuzz that, if we see it isolated, is adding these kind of things, which it looks a little bit like, you know, those well, pitch fuzz, which is a little bit deprecated as well, because later on I just added some in the groom. And then we have some light dirt. Instead of dirt, it's like a desaturation that I would expect for a used cloth to go through. And then we have the dark dirt, just been added a little bit randomly across the surface. And then we added a pattern, like the fibers, if we see it. That's a little bit of a cloth kind of pattern. It's very subtle though. And then we keep adding some light fibers and some random fuzz. This is a little bit more like, it's a little bit hard to see isolated, but it's like all those little how do you call them, like a thick dust that you start getting into the cloth with time, start getting intertwined with all the rest of the pattern of the actual fabric. And what else do we have? And then we have, this part is quite important, because you would expect the garments to be visible, right? It attacks the edges of the UVs, so it's pretty intense actually. It looks like this if it's isolated. And then we have a little bit of more color on those same edges, and then we have some dirt splotches that are like around the cloth, a little bit random. Then we have a little bit more of dirt. In this case, it's a little bit it's a gradient from like below. I also would expect, you know, these areas of the cloth that are like closer to the hands that they're actually manipulating all the time, or, you know, being touched by other objects more than the rest. It's probably more common than the inside of or the shoulders. And then we have some little red marks. This could be like ketchup or something like that. And then some random desaturated ones. And all of this, if you can see, you can notice one thing. I haven't added any stitches or anything like that, because we're gonna do that later in Katana in a more procedural way. Well, procedurally more, let's say resolution independent, because it's a very small detail, but it's always really nice to see. So before we jump into the part of the Lookdev where we do all the stitching and all this stuff, I wanted to show you what I did with the UVs, which is very important for this kind of setup. So I have plenty of UV sets in there, right? So this UV set is the common one for just painting everything, right? Separating in U-dims, everything is inside the edges. It's pretty tidy. So this one is the one I use to paint the albedo, as you saw in Substance Painter. And then I have other UVs, like stitches. I have a few of this, which are perfectly straight and completely out of the scale. I mean, they are in scale in between each other, but they are completely out of the scale from the rest of the cloth, because these are gonna exclusively be used for the stitches, right? So this means you can have small stitch in here and actually even repeat the pattern, and it's gonna go all the way up. It's gonna repeat infinitely. And the advantage of doing this is that the resolution is gonna be quite independent from the rest of the cloth. Otherwise, to have a very sharp stitching, you would need to have like a massive amount of UDIMs and a lot of textures, and even then that might not hold up in close-up stages. That's gonna be deprecated for another kind of workflow that is gonna be shown pretty soon by some friends that are developing the cloth that is actually done all with curves. But for now, for this project, it was pretty cool the fact that I could separate the stitching from the texture, from the general texture. And let me show you where this belongs to, right? So you can see this part of that part of the shirt is pretty big, and then you have all these parts, right? All of them that need a lot of resolution for the stitching. Same for this part, and then you have several of this. You have these ones as well, because you need the verticals and the horizontal ones. What else do we have? Well, the pockets are in a different one. You have to separate them by different types, right? Well, for example, if you have different kind of stitching in here than you have in here, the pockets have different stitching than you get in the sleeves, for example. And yeah, you keep separating them into its own type of stitching, and you keep having a few UV sets to play with later on inside of Katana. Now we're gonna jump into Nuke to create a few textures. I mean, you can do this anywhere, but I feel pretty comfortable dialing basically values for displacement maps inside of Nuke. It was pretty easy to do that. This is very, very exaggerated, so you can actually see it, but the actual output looks more something like this, right? So we exaggerate it so we can see it, and we can see that, for example, in the red channel, I'm using it for purely displacement, right? This is going to generate all the stitches that you're gonna see later. This is gonna generate all the wrinkles around the stitches and around the edges of what should be the garments, right? And in the blue channel, we're gonna have the masks for the actual stitches, which is gonna be useful later for the actual color of each of those. So now if we jump back into Katana, we're gonna get into the shirt, which is the kind of the texture I was showing you before, and we're going to get into here, which is, it looks pretty chaotic, but let me explain you a little bit what this is. Each one of these nodes, it contains one of the maps that I exported from Nuke, and each one of these are basically UV transform, which we are moving around to make it match exactly where we want the stitches to be, and then we are also specifying in which UV set they should be acting at, right? So if you see a render from this output, this is the output of the whole thing for the color and the displacement. But let's put it here in the surface so we can see it pretty quickly. We're just layering all those nodes, all these transforms. We are inputting all the stuff in the layer nodes in an overlay mode, so the colors mix properly. So if you just render this quickly, we're going to isolate the shirt. So this is the basic result. I'm gonna lower this a little bit so it's more visible to the eye. So basically what we're seeing here is all our maps that we saw in Nuke before. You're gonna see Let's cancel this one. It's making everything pretty slow. You're gonna see the red. This is the displacement. You can see that there are some wrinkles around the stitching. You can see that the resolution is pretty high and it's not constrained by the rest of the UVs because it has the exclusive UV sets that I showed you before. It's a little bit laborious to set this up like this, but afterwards you're gonna see that it's really worth it because you're gonna have results pretty much like this, right? You can see right in here how you have a lot of details in the stitches themselves, in the displacement around, and I think it's worth the work. The same thing has been applied to the t-shirt here. All of that is displacement, so it's pretty cool to see it when it turns around and everything. You can see that it's displacing the actual geometries, and it's pretty sharp in details. So that's basically how I set up the stitching. It's a bit laborious, but it's worth it at the end. Let's go through the texturing of the head. We had a couple of interesting things. I set up a few masks as well to play around with later. So as usual, we start with the base color, and then I'll continue with what would be the bluish parts of the head, and then there is a part that is supposed to be a little bit more yellowish, depending on where it's distributed in the head. There's more yellow areas, and then there is the reddish areas. This is like a little bit more the meaty parts where they're supposed to have more blood, right, circulating under the skin. And then we have a little bit more of this red. It's more yellow actually than red around the parts that have a little bit more fat. Then we have a little bit of the marks on the skin. These are like imperfections more than anything else. And we keep having a couple of blue areas. Now we're gonna define the lips a little bit, color them, and then we're gonna start adding what is. This is gonna be below the groom, but it's just to help out to distribute a little bit of those, little hairs inside the skin, the beard. Some freckles, adding more and more imperfections, and then we have the moles, which are on the other side. Here, these are the moles right there. What else do we have? And then we have a few things that are for the interior of the eyes that are not visible in this particular case. Another thing that is interesting is that I kept adding some. This is the height. I'm not sure how to use this. Finally, the roughness. That's nothing. And these are a few of the masks that I export later to use with Katana. Like for example, if I want the cheeks or the forehead to have a little bit more roughness, or to be darker or lighter, or any of that, I can just go ahead and use these masks. Same with these ones. If you can see, the interiors of the eyes are also masked in another channel. And then you have things like the lips, the exterior of the ears, and the interiors, and that's pretty much it. But we have IORs. I'm not using any of these normal maps. But we had something that was interesting, is the bump depth. Right? I'm using this as a mask later on, just to figure out where I want more or less bump in the face, which is always helpful. I found this very helpful to not having to come back and paint back and forth and export and re-render and try. So you can do all of that inside of Katana. I can show a little bit how you actually get into that. This is the shirt. Let's go into the head. So as you can see in here, for example, the subsurface. The inside of the eye is grabbing the mask from the inside, color correcting it, and then it goes into into the material. You can do the exact same thing with other masks just to modify the radius of the surface. It's very helpful to not have these very reddish areas in thinner parts, especially for my character, which has such thin borders, edges in some parts of the face.